connections to the toroidal surface, which I'm just going to call tonal space, we can now derive measures of expectation in each of these different representational spaces. And the way this works, so here is an example of a chord sequence from one of the studies ending on an unrelated target. And here is now the periodicity pitch image integrated with a short time constant. So it's really reflecting the moment-to-moment information in the sequence. And then here's what we're calling the global image, which is integrated with a longer time constant and therefore provides a more stable estimate of what key you're in. Okay? And now here's the critical thing. This is going to be the measure of expectation. You can ask, how well does the momentary image, how well does the local image fit with the global image? How well does it fit into the context? And the measure for that is simply a correlation. You correlate this moment in time with this moment in time here, and you get this particular value. And so this value, this is how well does the local context fit with the global context. And then the critical thing here is where the targets differ. When the target is related, you see that it fits well with the preceding context. When it's unrelated, you see this big dip here in the correlation because it doesn't fit very well. Okay? And so for the modeling effort then, what we can do is we can read off various values from this function, but what it turns out is best is to compare in a 200 millisecond window following the onset of the target stimulus. You subtract from this value, subtract the baseline values. So in the 100 milliseconds preceding the target, you're basically looking at the changing correlation. Did this event, this now created a worse fit with the preceding context, and so this is registered as an expectancy violation, whereas this is an expectancy fulfillment. Okay, and so it's going to be these values, these differences, which we can calculate in these different spaces, the periodicity pitch space or tonal space. Those are going to feed into a multiple regression model. Any questions about this before I move on? Because this is important to realize this is the measure of expectancy that we're going to be using. All right. So just to provide what I think is a nice illustration of how these different representational stages differ, this is from that experiment that used either pure tones or piano timbres for these melodies that ended either on the tonic or the subdominant, and where faster reaction times were observed for the tonic. And the point here is that you get different keys just based on changes of two pitches in the melody. Just two pitches will shift your interpretation of what key you're in. And so what we can do is now plot the correlation between your momentary estimate and the global image for the periodicity pitch representation. And this is now shown for 4 different melodies. The solid lines are played with a piano timbre. The dashed lines are played with pure tones. Okay. The dark lines mean that the ending is on the tonic, and the gray lines mean that the ending is on the weaker subdominant. Okay? And so what you notice in the periodicity pitch representation is that the grouping, here the dash is by timbre. So the dashed lines here for the pure tones, they're overlapping, and your piano timbres are overlapping here, but there's very little, actually not hardly anything at all, separating the different tonal functions. Okay, that's within the sensory model periodicity pitch image. which people like Mark Lehmann have argued is sufficient to explain the Carroll-Krumhansel tonal hierarchy results, in which, in fact, in many cases, it does. Okay? When you now project these images onto the torus, the story completely changes. So now the grouping is by the shade of the line, which reflects the tonal function, rather than by the timbre. So both pure tones and piano timbres are grouping together here, and they're grouping together here, but now the grouping is by, is it the tonic or the subdominant? And so when the last note is the subdominant, you can see the correlation here is much lower between the moment and the global context than it is when it ends on the tonic. Okay? So just that simple transformation of the representational space now gives you results that are consistent with the observations that a tonal schema is being activated in order to explain the differences in reaction times for targets that occupy different positions in the tonal hierarchy. All right, so you can nonetheless take all these different representational steps and ask how much variance do they explain in the overall reaction time data across all these studies. And basically the tonal space variables represent the most variance. But they're closely followed by the periodicity pitch images, and you can now feed it into a multiple regression model, actually into a stepwise regression model, and you find that tonal space enters first, and it's basically this changing correlation value that I was describing, which is the critical variable. Then for the periodicity pitch representation, then another measure on the periodicity pitch representation. And then coming in dead last, so are the chroma vectors. And if you just look at how well the chroma vectors alone explain the variance, it's about half as well as the periodicity pitch or the tonal space representation. So the somewhat surprising take-home message from these analyses were the chroma vectors, which are used so widely, actually don't do so well. And overall, we explain about 30% of the variance, and we succeed in explaining data from 4 out of 7 experiments. Well, this was great, but it was kind of disappointing. We only did better than competing models by explaining data from 1 additional experiment, and we really wanted to explain the data from all 7 experiments. So we had to add one more step, one more representational step to our model, and this brings up the issue of syntax. Okay. As a little side note here, I like to point out that brain responses to harmonic expectancy violations are commonly assumed to reflect syntactic processing. Okay? So Ani Patel and Stefan Kolsch have written lots of papers about this topic, but it's important to remember that in almost all of these studies for which this has been claimed, there's no formal dissociation between the 0th order probability of an event, meaning how expected is that event given the overall key that's been primed by the preceding context. Okay, so once you've primed your context, now you take an event that fits well, one that doesn't fit so well, one that fits even less well. You'll get your expectancy violations just fine, but that's actually not a model of syntax. Okay, in order to get syntax, you've actually got to take into account the specific sequential relationships between your chords and your chord sequences. So syntax would ask questions about, say, first order transition probabilities or higher order transition probabilities, which is the expectedness of an event given the specific sequence of preceding chords. Okay, so that's just a little bit of a soapbox moment there. Okay, so what we try to do in this paper was to not model all of syntax. It's really complex, and there are brilliant people like Martin Rohrmeyer and others thinking about those issues, but we just wanted to model a particular instance. And that is that all of these, and that is closure. Okay, so all of these experiments that have been done to ask how well does an event fit with the preceding context, most of the time you're making a judgment about the final event in the sequence. And whenever you have a final event in the sequence, you're kind of expecting some sort of closure. Right? When we're listening to music, most music ends up resolving on the tonic, right, to bring about this sense of closure. And so we decided to just incorporate this element of closure. How well does that final event fit, or how well does that final transition fit? And so the consideration here was to consider that local global correlation. So how well does that final event fit with the global context? Okay. That's along this axis. And then we can ask, how well does the penultimate event fit in the global context? And the idea here is if it's the final event is the tonic, okay, the most representative of that key, then it's going to fit really, really well, okay? Whereas, the preceding event may have fit well, but it need not have fit very well. But the final one is going to fit very well. Whereas if somehow the final event is the subdominant, which is less related to the global context, then it would not fit so well, right? So you would potentially see a transition from a high, well-fitting event to a less fitting event, and that would not provide a sense of closure, whereas a transition from a less fitting event to a high-fitting event would provide a sense of closure. And we actually tried to model this empirically. We pulled, just took ripped CD tracks, 2,300 different pieces or movement endings from classical and pop genres, basically from my CD collection. And we ran those all through the model, and we looked at this transition probability between the next to last event and the last event, and you kind of get this empirical distribution that's smooth here. Anyway, we can now fit this closure into the model, and now it's only a modest improvement in the overall amount of variance explained, but we now capture all of the trends from the different experiments. So here, each panel reflects one of the 7 different experiments, each bar one of the different stimulus categories, and then on the left are the observed reaction time data relative to the mean within the experiment. And then on the right are the fitted reaction time data. And though you may quickly note that the reaction time magnitudes aren't necessarily fitted particularly well, the critical comparison is if you ask, can you now statistically distinguish the different stimulus categories and how well they're fit, then the relative pattern here can be fit quite well across all of the experiments. And so here, if we compare this with the most common sensory model or the most common sort of cognitive model that was being used mainly by Barbara Tillman, this model created by Jamshed Barucha called MUSAC, the different experiments. In some cases, these models simply couldn't model the data given the representational limitations of the model. Here then are our models without closure or with closure, and this is a little pat on the back moment that, okay, we did really pretty well. Okay? But the take-home message here, it's both these cognitive and these sensory contributions to the expectations, and there's still certainly work to be done to better explain the vagaries of any given experiment. And obviously, this is just the first step in then modeling syntax. Right? The big challenge for this toroidal model is now to actually extract symbols from the toroidal activations and to actually be able to build syntactic models. Okay, I'm going to stop here for a moment. This was probably about 2/3 of the talk, and I'm going to try to apply all of this stuff to brain data. But let me just stop here and take any questions.
I'm just curious about the toroidal shape. Why toroidal and not, say, spherical or any other shape?
Yeah, so that arises from, so the fact that the circle of fifths itself is circular, so you have to somehow be able to fit a circle. But then the other constraint are the minor keys. And the fact that a major key is related to two minor keys. It's related to the parallel minor, which shares the same tonic, okay, but a fairly different set of pitch classes. And then it's also related to the relative minor, which has a different tonic, but it shares all the same pitch classes. And so you have this requirement now to preserve all of those relationships. And you have your circle of fifths for the major keys and then also for the minor keys. How can you preserve those relationships? Well, you can preserve them by tilting those circles of fifths and now wrapping them in an interleaved manner around the surface of a torus.
So mathematically, like, how would that be some strange number of dimensions, or is that?
No, so it's, it's two circular dimensions. Yeah. Yeah, Ed?
So I honestly wasn't quite sure I followed where the benefit came from closure. So closure is now a two-dimensional representation? It's now a two-dimensional quantity, right?
Yes. Well, actually, I need to actually go back and check. No, the closure will still should still be the difference between that local global correlation of the final to the penultimate event. So are you moving towards more closure, or are you moving towards less closure? Expressed as a difference in those two correlation coefficients.
Oh, there's a difference between correlation coefficients.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and the main benefit is that for a couple of these models, you end up fitting the responses to the tonic better. So you actually imbue the tonic with this added benefit of having returned to the tonic. Yeah, overall, the proportion of variances that's explained is relative, in addition now, by adding closure, is relatively small, but it's enough to distinguish between these categories. Yeah?
I was wondering if you use any different analysis techniques on the original audio signal before feeding it into the model, apart from the autocorrelation periodicity measure.
No, not other than running it through the von Immersiel-Martens model of the cochlear transduction process. I mean, I fully recognize that there are other more popular models out there, like Patterson's model. But at the end of the day, if I think however you arrive at these periodicity pitch estimates, if you assume a periodicity pitch type of model, it would feed in seamlessly to
It wouldn't make a difference in that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah, so this is really interesting. Just in a sense, a simple statistical question. I'm curious how you might respond to this. So if I'm understanding the model correctly, the components that are being referred to as cognitive fundamentally require prior processing for the components that go from the sensory, right? So there's a sense in which the cognitive parameters are statistical parameters, predictors that are in addition to the sensory components. So I guess there's a sense in which you could see this, and now I'm generally in favor of what you're finding. I'm just wondering how you respond to this sort of I could generate a regression model only with eccentric components, and then I can add the cognitive components on top of it. In the sense, I'm adding parameters, so I need to somehow correct for the fit that's improved by my model, but I am adding parameters. So I wonder if, is there some way that you address this sort of thing, and this notion that there's a logical hierarchy in the sense that the cognitive predictors are on top of the eccentric ones. So can you sort of, like running AIC or something like that?
Yeah. Well, right. So there are a couple of issues there. So I can't remember now whether or not we ran AIC comparisons of the model fit, but certainly, if you have more degrees of freedom there that are in the numerator. I mean, you're still, it's a less parsimonious model if you add more variables. The other issue, though, is sort of this notion of sort of the feed-forward signal, and you need to have the sensory aspects in there before you add the cognitive aspects. And in fact, one of the reviewers of the paper brought this up, to which our response was that, yes, while this model currently is strictly feed-forward, we're still assuming that the decision process, right, that's ultimately making the response still has access to any of these representational stages. And so it can access the sensory stage, it can access the tonal space stage, and that presumably can do that in parallel. And so in that case, then the regression models don't need to respect strictly the processing hierarchy in terms of how we enter that information. Yeah, David.